The Colorado autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves as rancher Matthew Collins rode toward his homestead after a long day checking cattle in the high meadows. At 47, Matthew had lived alone on his ranch for 8 years since his wife's death, finding solace in the hard work and quiet rhythms of mountain life. As he approached his cabin, movement near his small orchard caught his eye. A thin figure was huddled beneath one of his apple trees, and Matthew's first thought was that one of his neighbor's children had wandered onto his property. But as he drew closer, Matthew realized this wasn't a neighbor's child. The figure was a boy of perhaps 10 years old, dressed in clothes that were little more than rags, his thin frame suggesting prolonged hunger. Most disturbing of all, the boy was cradling his right hand against his chest in a way that spoke of injury. "Son," Matthew called out gently as he dismounted. "Are you hurt?" The boy looked up with eyes that held far too much pain and fear for someone so young. His face was streaked with tears and dirt, and Matthew could see that he was trembling, though whether from cold, pain, or fear was impossible to tell. "I'm sorry, mister," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to steal. I was just so hungry." Matthew looked at the ground beneath the apple tree and saw several fallen apples, but no evidence that the boy had actually taken any fruit from the tree itself. "What's your name, son?" "Charlie," the boy replied, still clutching his injured hand. "Charlie Walsh." "Charlie, I'm Matthew Collins, and this is my ranch. Can you show me your hand? I'd like to see what's wrong with it." The boy's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. He pulled his hand even closer to his chest and shrank back against the tree trunk, as if expecting to be struck. "Please don't hurt me more," Charlie begged. "I know I was bad, but it already hurts so much." Matthew felt something cold settle in his stomach as he began to understand what he was seeing. This wasn't an accident or an injury from ranch work. Someone had deliberately hurt this child. "Charlie," Matthew said, keeping his voice as gentle as possible, "I'm not going to hurt you. I want to help. Can you tell me what happened to your hand?" The boy was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with whether to trust this stranger. Finally, with the exhausted honesty that sometimes comes when there's nowhere left to run, Charlie spoke. "They burned my hand for touching the apples," he said simply. The words hit Matthew like a physical blow. Someone had burned this child's hand as punishment for trying to eat when he was hungry. "Who burned your hand?" "Charlie, Mr. Garrett at the workhouse," Charlie replied, and Matthew could see the boy steeling himself for another punishment. He said thieves needed to learn what happens when they take things that don't belong to them. Matthew's hands clenched into fists as rage flooded through him. The image of an adult deliberately burning a child's hand for the crime of hunger was almost too horrible to process. "Charlie," Matthew said, fighting to keep his voice calm, "may I look at your hand? I promise I won't hurt you, but I need to see how badly you're injured." After a moment's hesitation, Charlie slowly extended his right hand. What Matthew saw made him feel physically sick. The boy's palm and fingers showed the clear marks of a deliberate burn, red and blistered and obviously painful. Someone had pressed something hot against this child's hand and held it there long enough to cause serious injury. Without thinking, Matthew reached out and gently took Charlie's injured hand in both of his own, cradling it as if it were made of precious glass. "Oh, son," Matthew whispered, and felt tears begin to stream down his face. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories. You won't believe how this act of compassion begins the healing process. Charlie stared at Matthew in amazement. In his short, hard life, he'd never seen an adult cry over his pain. Most adults had been the source of his pain, not people who grieved over it. "Why are you crying, mister?" Charlie asked in wonder. "Because someone hurt you," Matthew replied honestly. "Because you're just a little boy who was hungry, and someone burned your hand for trying to get food. Are you going to take me back to the workhouse?" Matthew looked into Charlie's frightened eyes and made a promise that would change both their lives forever. "No one is ever going to hurt you like this again," Matthew said firmly. "You're staying here with me where you'll be safe." "But I don't have any money to pay you," Charlie protested weakly. "You don't need money," Matthew assured him. "You need medicine for your hand, food in your belly, and someone to care about what happens to you, as Matthew carefully helped Charlie to his feet and led him toward the cabin. Both of them understood that something profound had just happened. The boy who'd been punished with deliberate cruelty had found someone who saw his pain and chose to heal rather than hurt. Matthew had found something he hadn't realized he'd been missing, a purpose beyond his own survival, and someone to protect and nurture back to wholeness. The burned hand would heal, but more importantly, the trust that began when Matthew held that injured hand and cried would grow into something that would transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. 2 months had passed since Matthew Collins had found Charlie Walsh beneath his apple tree, and the transformation in both their lives had been remarkable. The physical burns on Charlie's hand were healing well under Matthew's careful treatment, but the deeper wounds of fear and mistrust were taking longer to mend. Charlie had proven to be everything Matthew had sensed in that first meeting: intelligent, hardworking despite his injuries, and possessed of a resilience that amazed the rancher. Daily, but the boy still flinched when adults raised their voices, still hoarded food as if he expected it to be taken away, and still sometimes woke from nightmares about the workhouse. "Mr. Matthew," Charlie said one morning as they worked together, feeding the horses, "my hand doesn't hurt anymore when I use it." Matthew looked at the boy's right hand, noting how the angry red burns had faded to pink scars that would likely remain for the rest of Charlie's life. But more importantly, Charlie was using the hand normally again, without the protective cradling that had characterized those first weeks. "That's wonderful, son," Matthew replied. "Dr. Peterson said you might have full use of it again if the healing went well." Charlie flexed his fingers experimentally, then looked up at Matthew with an expression that was part gratitude and part lingering disbelief. "Why did you help me?" Charlie asked. "At the workhouse, they said nobody would ever want a boy who'd been marked as a thief." Matthew felt his heart clench at the casual cruelty that had convinced this child he was worthless. "Charlie, you're not marked as anything except brave. You survived something terrible, and that makes you stronger, not damaged." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Matthew looked up to see 3 riders coming toward the ranch, and something about their official bearing made his protective instincts surge. The lead rider was a middle-aged man in a dark suit, flanked by 2 younger men who had the look of hired muscle. As they drew closer, Matthew could see official badges that identified them as representatives of the territorial child welfare system. "Are you Matthew Collins?" the lead rider asked as he dismounted. "I am," Matthew replied cautiously, moving slightly to place himself between the strangers and Charlie. "I'm Inspector Harold Morrison from the Territorial Child Welfare Bureau. I'm here about the boy you've been harboring illegally." Charlie immediately pressed closer to Matthew's side, his face pale with terror at the sight of official authority. "I'm not harboring anyone illegally," Matthew said firmly. "I'm caring for a child who needed help." "That child is a ward of the state," Morrison replied pompously. "He escaped from a properly licensed facility and needs to be returned immediately." Matthew looked down at Charlie, seeing the fear and desperation in the boy's eyes. The properly licensed facility had burned his hand for trying to eat. "Mr. Morrison," Matthew said carefully, "may I ask what you know about the conditions at this facility?" "I know it provides discipline and structure for wayward children," Morrison replied. "Something this boy clearly needs. And do you know about the methods they use to provide this discipline?" Morrison looked uncomfortable. "I'm not here to debate institutional policies. I'm here to collect a runaway ward." Subscribe to our channel now. The confrontation that follows will test everything Matthew and Charlie have built together. Matthew realized he was facing a man who either didn't know about the abuse at the workhouse or didn't care. Either way, Charlie was in danger of being returned to the place that had tortured him. "Charlie," Matthew said gently, "show Mr. Morrison your hand." "No," Charlie said immediately, hiding his hand behind his back. "I don't want them to see." "Son," Matthew said reassuringly, "you're not in trouble. I want Mr. Morrison to understand why you can't go back there." Reluctantly, Charlie extended his scarred hand. The burns had healed, but the pattern of deliberate injury was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. "Good Lord," Morrison breathed. his official composure cracking as he saw the evidence of deliberate cruelty. "What happened to his hand?" "They burned it," Charlie said simply. "Mr. Garrett said I needed to learn not to touch things that didn't belong to me." Morrison stared at the scarred hand, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. "You're saying the workhouse staff deliberately burned this child?" "For the crime of trying to eat when he was hungry," Matthew confirmed. The silence that followed was profound, as Morrison grappled with the reality that the properly licensed facility, under his supervision, had been torturing children. This can't be right," Morrison said weakly. "There are regulations, inspections." "When was the last time you personally visited the workhouse?" Matthew asked. Morrison's uncomfortable silence was answer enough. "Mr. Morrison," Matthew continued, "I don't know what reports you've been getting, but the reality is that this boy was systematically abused by people who were supposed to protect him. I found him half-starved, injured, and terrified. Are you really planning to send him back to that?" Morrison looked at Charlie, seeing not just the physical evidence of abuse, but the obvious terror in the boy's eyes at the prospect of returning to his tormentors. What are you proposing, Mr. Collins?" "I'm proposing that Charlie stays here, where he's safe and cared for. I'll apply for legal guardianship and take full responsibility for his welfare. And if the investigation shows that the workhouse is properly run after all," Matthew's answer was quiet, but carried unmistakable determination, "then I'll fight that finding in every court in the territory. No child should ever be burned for being hungry." Morrison studied Matthew's resolute face, then looked again at Charlie's scarred hand. "I'll need to file a full report about this situation," he said finally, "and there will need to be a formal investigation of the workhouse." "Will Charlie have to go back while you investigate?" Matthew asked. Morrison looked at the boy who was clinging to Matthew's side like a lifeline. "No," he said quietly. "No, I think he's better off staying right where he is." As the officials prepared to leave, Morrison made one final comment that would stay with both Matthew and Charlie. "Mr. Collins," Morrison said, "I've been doing this job for 10 years, and I've seen a lot of children in bad situations. But I've never seen a boy look at anyone the way this one looks at you. Whatever you're doing here, keep doing it." After the men left, Matthew knelt down to Charlie's level and took the boy's scarred hand in both of his. "They're not taking you away, son," Matthew said firmly. "You're home now." Charlie looked at his healed hand, then up at the man who'd cried over his pain and fought to protect him from further harm. "Mr. Matthew," Charlie said quietly, "when you first held my hand and cried, I thought you were sad because I was broken. And now I think you were crying because you knew I could be fixed." Charlie replied with wisdom beyond his ears. As they walked back toward the cabin together, both Matthew and Charlie understood that the healing process was about more than just burned skin. It was about learning to trust, to hope, and to believe that love could overcome even the cruelest wounds. 1 year had passed since Matthew Collins had found Charlie Walsh beneath his apple tree, and the anniversary brought visitors that neither of them had expected. Dr. Sarah Peterson, the territory's leading authority on child welfare, had come to conduct the final evaluation that would determine Charlie's permanent placement. But Dr. Peterson hadn't come alone. With her were 2 other figures that made Charlie's face light up with joy. Inspector Morrison, who'd undergone a remarkable transformation since discovering the abuse at the workhouse, and most surprisingly, 3 other children who'd been rescued from similar situations. "Charlie," Dr. Peterson said with a warm smile, "I wanted you to meet some other children who found new homes thanks to the investigation that started with your case." The 3 children, ranging in age from 8 to 12, had been placed with carefully screened families throughout the territory. But what made their presence even more significant was that they'd all requested to meet the boy whose courage in revealing his abuse had led to their own rescue. "You're the one who showed the burned hand," said the oldest, a girl named Sarah, "because you were brave enough to tell the truth. They closed down the workhouse and found real homes for all of us." Charlie looked amazed at the idea that his pain could have led to something positive for others. "I didn't do anything special," Charlie said quietly. "I just told Mr. Matthew what happened. That was everything." replied the youngest boy, who introduced himself as Tommy. "Before you spoke up, nobody knew how bad it was. You saved all of us." Dr. Peterson had been observing the interaction between Charlie and Matthew throughout the visit, and what she saw confirmed everything her year-long investigation had revealed. "Mr. Collins," she said as the other children played in the yard, "I've completed my evaluation of Charlie's placement here." Matthew felt his heart race, though he tried to keep his expression calm. "And your conclusion?" "My conclusion is that Charlie Walsh is the luckiest boy in Colorado Territory," Dr. Peterson said with a smile. "In 20 years of child welfare work, I've never seen a more successful placement." She went on to detail what her investigation had found. Charlie was thriving academically, physically, and emotionally. His nightmares had stopped, his health had improved dramatically, and most importantly, he'd developed the kind of secure attachment that would serve him well for the rest of his life. "There's something else," Dr. Peterson continued. "The territorial government has asked me to discuss a proposal with you." "What kind of proposal?" "They want to establish a training program for prospective adoptive families, using your ranch as a demonstration site. You'd work with other adults who want to help children like Charlie, teaching them what successful placement and healing look like." Subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories. You won't believe how this story of healing becomes a beacon of hope for countless other children. Matthew looked at Charlie, who was showing the other children around the ranch with obvious pride and happiness, the transformation from the terrified, injured boy he'd found under the apple tree was remarkable. "What do you think, Charlie?" Matthew asked. "Would you like to help other children who've been hurt like you were?" Charlie's response showed the empathy and strength that had developed during his year of healing. "If we can help them find families like ours," Charlie said seriously, "then yes. Every kid should have someone who cries when they're hurt instead of being the one who hurts them." 6 months later, the Collins Ranch Child Healing Center had become the most successful program of its kind in the Western Territories. Matthew and Charlie worked together to help other abused and neglected children begin their own healing journeys, while also training adults to become effective adoptive parents. But the moment that meant the most came on a quiet evening as Matthew and Charlie sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Pa," Charlie said, using the title that had developed naturally over the months, "do you remember that first day when you held my burned hand?" "I remember," Matthew replied. "I thought it was the worst day of my life." Charlie continued, "My hand hurt so much, I was starving, and I thought nobody in the world cared whether I lived or died." And now, Charlie held up his right hand, studying the faint scars that remained as permanent reminders of his past. "Now I think it was the best day of my life, because it was the day I found out what love looks like." "What does love look like?" Matthew asked. "Love looks like someone who sees your pain and chooses to help instead of hurt." Charlie replied with wisdom that amazed Matthew daily. "Love looks like someone who cries when you're injured and fights to make sure you're never hurt again." Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of healing, hope, and the power of compassionate love from the American frontier. Hit that subscribe button now, because these tales prove that even the cruelest wounds can be healed by genuine care and understanding. 10 years later, Dr. Charlie Collins graduated from medical school with a specialization in treating childhood trauma. His adoption of Matthew's surname had been legal for years, but more importantly, it represented the complete healing of a boy who'd been broken by cruelty and restored by love. In his graduation speech, Charlie spoke about the power of compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. "Someone once burned my hand for trying to eat when I was hungry," Charlie told the assembled crowd, "but another person held that same hand and cried over my pain." The difference between those two responses is the difference between cruelty and love, between despair and hope. Every patient I treat will receive the same care that saved my life, the understanding that healing begins when someone chooses to see pain and respond with compassion rather than judgment. As Matthew watched his son accept his medical degree, he reflected on the journey that had brought them both to this moment. The burned hand had healed long ago, But the love that had begun when he'd held that injured hand and cried had grown into something that would touch countless other lives. They burned my hand for touching the apples, Charlie had said that first day. But from that moment of cruelty had come a lifetime of healing, proving that love could indeed triumph over even the worst that humans could inflict on each other. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these incredible tales of healing, hope, and transformative love to life. Subscribe now and join us for more amazing stories that prove compassion can overcome even the cruelest circumstances.